Book Fair, Children's Literature for Grown-Ups. I'm Anthony, and this week we have an interview with author Alice Hoffman for her new book, When We Flew Away, a novel of Anne Frank before the diary. Amy Sarig King starts the nonprofit Gracie's House in honor of daughter Gracie King. Authors for Harris-Walz 2024 release a sign-on letter, and the National Book Awards for Young People's Literature has been fully released. Beginning first with the finalists for 2024 National Book Awards for Young People's Literature. The National Book Foundation has revealed the 5 finalists for the 2024 National Book Award for Young People's Literature. They are Violet Duncan for Buffalo Dreamer, Josh Galarza for The Great Cool Ranch Dorito in the Sky, Erin Entrada Kelly for The First State of Being, Shifa Saftagi Safadi for Kareem Between, and Angela Shante for The Unboxing of a Black Girl. Teens Read the National Book Awards, formerly known as the Teen Press Conference, will take place on the morning of November 19th at Peter Norton Symphony Space in New York City, hosted by National Book Award winner Jacqueline Woodson. The event for local middle and high school students will include readings, followed by a Q&A and book signing with the 5 finalists. The conference will be live-streamed, and the first 25 public school educators to register will receive 1 set of the finalists' books. The winners will be announced on November 20th at the National Book Awards invitation-only 75th Awards ceremony at Cipriani Wall Street in New York City. The awards will also be broadcast live. Next up, A.S. King builds Gracie's House, an inclusive nonprofit. To honor the late Gracie King, author A.S. King and her son create an organization for LGBTQ youth and families. Out of a tragedy and profound loss, author A.S. King and her son Jackson King, 17, are building Gracie's House, a nonprofit that creates safe spaces for queer youth and diverse families. Gracie's House will offer sleepaway camps for LGBTQ young people in grades 4 through 12 and their families, adult camps for queer people seeking positive camping experiences, and grants for community programming in support of folks with LGBTQ identities. On September 20th, the Kings announced their first week-long sleepaway camp to be held at Berks County, PA in summer 2025. They also have a strategic plan to grow the organization through 2029 and are open to sponsors, donors, and potential artists in residence. Now reading directly from the website for Gracie's House, their mission: the 3 goals of Gracie's House. We award grants to organizations to open or maintain safe spaces for LGBTQ+ youth in rural areas. We run Found Camps, a sleepaway summer camp, and Found Family weekend camps for LGBTQ+ youth and their families at an award-winning camp location in Pennsylvania. We encourage expression and provide means for organizations to run arts and music-focused workshops and events to support the voices of LGBTQ+ youth. Why it matters. Young LGBTQ+ people endure bullying, including individual, societal, and governmental, at increased rates compared to their cis-straight peers. In urban or more accepting environments, there is more support at hand. By and large, rural areas have often left LGBTQ+ youth and their families isolated and without resources. As these areas continue to grow, LGBTQ+ organizations, we would like to help them maintain safe community spaces for their youth. We provide a partnership with peer educators for parents on the child's gender or sexuality journey in order to expand the idea of safe spaces into homes all over the country. Gracie's House was named for this reason. Our home has always been a safe space for LGBTQ+ youth, and our wish is that in time, every home follows suit. Get more information about bullying and suicide statistics relating to LGBTQ+ youth from the incredible Trevor Project. And next, Kidlit for Kamala generates momentum with author endorsements. More than 700 authors and illustrators have endorsed Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris and VP candidate Tim Walz in a letter circulated by the coalition Kidlit for Kamala. Timing their announcement to Banned Books Week, Kidlit for Kamala called the letter the first example of authors working cross-genre to support a presidential candidate, with signatories including novelists Kelly Link, Celeste Ng, and crossover author Renee Watson, as well as creators Kathy Appelt, Tracy Baptiste, Holly Black, David Levithan, Brian Selznick, and Paul O. Zelensky. Quote, "The outreach for this letter has been an amazing effort. Across creative networks, Celeste Puter, a founding member of Kidlit for Kamala, told PW, quote, "We shared it strategically online and were blown away by the enthusiasm. It's been a really great opportunity to meet writers from other genres." Reading directly from the letter, authors for Harris-Walz sign-on letter release date September 23, 2024. We are storytellers. Our words and images reflect the soul of the human experience. Our work builds bridges to magical universes and opens doors to boundless possibilities. Our stories entertain, inspire, and challenge readers to be brave and find truths in the world within themselves. Sometimes our stories save lives. We don't have to imagine a day when the government silences our voices. The systematic targeting, attacking, and erasure of our work by Republican lawmakers is creeping across the country as they attempt to enact book bans nationwide. In 2023 alone, 4,240 books were targeted for censorship, while there were 1,247 demands made to censor library books, materials, and resources. What's happening now is hurting creators, especially those who have struggled for generations to secure a space on the shelves. It is hurting teachers and librarians who don't feel safe sharing books with their students. It is hurting young readers today and in each successive class, who will see their libraries dwindling, their libraries deemed suppressible, and their identities invalidated with each book banned and library shuttered. And it is hurting young readers who are just beginning to see themselves on the page, who deserve to encounter challenging ideas, expand their empathy, and build their sense of self-worth. Partisan school boards and extremist activists are stealing their freedom to thrive. We're not going back to laws that silence creative expression and policies that hurt people for being who they are. We will defend the freedom to read. For further information, resources for the podcast are linked at patreon.com/thebookfair. Posts are not restricted behind a subscription, though any support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's move on to recent releases. Firstly, we have The Bakery Dragon by Devin Elle Kurtz. Like all dragons, Little Ember loves gold. He first appears curled up on a huge, glowing pile of coins and other glittering objects, a cache that belonged to one of the big dragons who regularly rob the local village. When Ember tries his claws at theft, though, he's a complete washout. Tired and reluctant to return to their lair empty-handed, Ember falls asleep in front of a warm bakery window. After a massive storm rolls in, the kindly local baker offers shelter and teaches the dragon to make golden loaves of bread, so delicious that the other dragons are willing to pay anything for them. Kurtz, making a polished solo debut, leavens digital illustrations reminiscent of classic animation with smart narrative pacing and a wry sense of humor. Chef's Kiss panels devoted to Ember's apprenticeship and skill at bread making, even his hand-washing seems purposeful, are so winning that readers may well clamor to get their hands on some dough. This book is recommended for ages 4 to 8. Next up, Jasmine is Haunted by Mark Oshiro. Spirits have repeatedly chased 8th grader Jasmine Garza and her mammy from their rental homes, so they've moved multiple times since Pappy died. While trying to fit in at her new school, she meets queer and genderqueer B. Veracruz and Jorge Barrera, who is gay. B, whose parents are professional supernatural investigators, is immediately intrigued by Jasmine's claim that she's haunted and invites her to join the Gay Supernatural Alliance. As members of the GSA, B and Jorge investigate paranormal events in their school, and they're certain they can help Jasmine not only figure out what is haunting her, but more importantly, get it to stop. Jasmine soon finds herself at a crossroads and must decide if she's ready to forge her own path. Empathy plays a key role in this captivating and emotionally nuanced paranormal adventure that explores themes of a family's secrets and heritage. Spine-tingling descriptions of the trio's experiences with things beyond the veil, such as pulsating and oozing shadows, add tension to meditations on life and death as seen through a Latinx narrator's eyes. This book is recommended for ages 8 to 12. And finally, The Last Dragon on Mars by Scott Reintgen. In this rip-roaring series launch from Reintgen, dragons are the living embodiment of celestial bodies. Earth is only habitable because its dragon Gaia sacrificed herself. A century before the tales start, people headed for Mars, assuming its dragon Ares would be similarly selfless. Ares refused, however, sparking a war that ended when the dragons of Mars's moons killed Ares. With his dying breath, Ares turned Mars's plants, animals, and weather against humans. Now Martian society is nearing collapse, and orphan 13-year-old Lunar Jones must risk his life salvaging scrap to support himself. While hiding from murderous rivals, Lunar finds a secret bunker that's home to juvenile dragon Dread and a squadron of kids training to be his flight crew. Dread has the potential to save Mars and wants resourceful Lunar to be the crew's new captain, balancing fraught interpersonal drama with expertly choreographed action and gleefully imaginative world-building. This book is recommended for ages 10 and up. Coming up next, an interview with author Alice Hoffman for her new book, When We Flew Away, a novel of Anne Frank before the diary. If you enjoy the work done on the podcast, there are easy ways to show support. First, you can leave a review or rating wherever you listen to the podcast. You can also follow on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at BookFairPod. You can also find more information about the resources used on Patreon. Follow for free or give a monthly contribution at patreon.com/thebookfair. Of course, the easiest way to help is by sharing the podcast, either with a friend, an educator, or a young reader in your life. Now, on to the interview with Alice Hoffman. Hello, Alice. How are you doing this morning?
Hi, nice to talk to you.
So, just to start off the interview, could you explain for the audience who you are and some of the work you've done before When We Flew Away?
Oh, yeah. My name is Alice Hoffman, and I am a writer, and I've spent my life writing novels for all different ages of readerships, and I think I've written about 30 or 35 books.
Okay. And what is the story of When We Flew Away?
When We Flew Away is the story of Anne Frank, who was the author of The Diary of a Young Girl, Anne Frank's Diary. And it's a story of her life and her family's life before they were forced to go into hiding to escape the Nazis in Amsterdam. And
would you consider this a historical fiction, or is this more based on true events?
Yeah, no, I consider it historical fiction. All the facts are the facts, and I worked very closely with the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam and was lucky enough to work with their historians and their experts. So anything that's a fact has been checked, 10 times. But, it's a historical novel because really in order to write about characters that you sort of have no knowledge about certain aspects of their life. You don't know what conversations they had with each other. You don't know how they spent certain days. That you don't know what their dreams were. you have to kind of fictionalize it and invent it.
That's interesting because one of the things I did want to ask about was how much of Anne Frank's life outside of her diary is 100% known for certain.
Yeah, there are certain facts. We know where she went to school, what reports she did in school, where she went on vacation with her father. I mean, those sorts of things we know. But what was said at the time, what she thought or felt or dreamt, we don't know that.
And in When We Flew Away, Anne Frank is portrayed as a very imaginative and free spirit. And how much of that is drawn from her writings in the diary, and how much of that is drawn from what we can extrapolate from other materials?
Yeah, I didn't use the diary per se for this book that I wrote because that happens after. That happens when she's 13. My book ends when she's turning 13. So I didn't use that much material from the diary itself. But I think, there was a lot of information written about her from before, and I wanted to stay within that time period of before the diary.
And the book does take place in Amsterdam starting in 1940, around the time of Nazi occupation. Were there any challenges with writing a book from a child's perspective about such a serious topic?
That's an interesting question because I think, in the Frank family, at any rate, they wanted to protect their children from knowing too much about kind of the cruelty of the world. I think, we all tend to do that with our children, and they tried to protect them, but, there was a time where, and they were really protecting themselves. It's kind of what was happening was so unbelievable, and there was such, barbarism, and it was just, they just couldn't believe what was happening around them. It was so uncivilized. It was so hard to believe. That it was almost too late by the time they realized what was happening. The Frank family, Otto Frank, the father, did try very hard to get them out of the Netherlands and was unable to. He had a very good friend in New York who was very wealthy and connected, knew the Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the president, and he still could not get them out of the Netherlands.
And you mentioned that the Frank family was trying to protect their children, and that was definitely something that other media portrays a lot, like Life is Beautiful is one of my favorite movies that shows that aspect quite a bit. Mm-hmm. And Anne Frank's diary, I swear I'm getting to a point here, Anne Frank's diary is one of the most challenged books. Even this year has seen multiple challenges in public schools and libraries. And whenever the topic of book banning comes up, Moms for Liberty always hides behind the guise of protecting their children.
Interesting.
Isn't that...
Yeah. Well,
that's such a...
They're protecting them from having compassion for people who are unlike themselves. I mean, I always feel like that's a big part of why reading is so great and why people want to ban books, is that as a reader, you read about other people's lives, but you feel it. You feel what they feel, and it makes you a compassionate, tolerant person. And I think that's the big fear with wanting to ban books.
Yes, and I think that compassion and that sense of empathy, that allowing a reader to enter a world, is one of the most important things. And that's why I really like to focus on children's literature. And so with something like When We Flew Away, and with all these challenges, are you worried of any kind of pushback from any of these reactionist groups with the release of this book?
I mean, I don't know. I'm not personally worried. I worry about them all the time. I think as a child, for me, when I walked into the library by myself, that was the first time I felt like freedom. I felt like I could read whatever I wanted to. It was a world that I walked into and claimed for myself. I think it's so important for kids to have that, and such a crime to limit what people can read. If you don't like something, if it offends you, put down the book if you don't want to read it. So I don't worry for my book in particular. I just worry. But I think this is not unusual, and it's happened, before. It was certainly happening at the time that Anne Frank was living, where books were thought of as dangerous things. And that's one of the reasons I love the book Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, where, it's a society in the future where books are burned. And, once books are burned, what comes next?
Right. And it's such a chilling reality. And that's something that with When We Flew Away, there's almost this unescapable sense of dread that comes from the foresight of knowing that with this optimistic and carefree young girl, there is a horrible, horrible future. And that hate and that violence is something that is just a part of history that we know that she wasn't able to prepare for.
Yeah. Yeah, no, 100%. And that's one of the challenges for me as a writer, was to not think about the end, because I had to write it as if I didn't know exactly what the ending was going to be, because I was following her life and she didn't know what the ending was going to be. And so as readers, we do know the ending. And it's interesting to see, I think, the ways in which she begins to slowly realize what's happening all around her.
Right. And as I was reading through it, I think the way that I would describe it is bittersweet optimism, where Anne has so many dreams for the future of wanting to flee to California and living in the United States, and just knowing that that's not something that she's going to achieve, but she carries that dream with her. It really is bittersweet and optimistic at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's really moving, because her dreams are, she's an extraordinary person, but in a way her dreams are ordinary. What so many girls have, they wanting to go to California and meet movie stars and walk along the beach and, have this life in America and be a writer and have ambition. And it's definitely bittersweet, because as a reader, I mean, not all readers will know this, but we know what the ending is going to be.
Right. And it is one of the most taught portions of world history, not just World War II, but Anne Frank and her diary is something that's used a lot in schools even today. So it is like a lot of people know what happens, but we don't really think about it. And with When We Flew Away, when creating this fictionalized world of true events, what was it like kind of bringing out these characters that are real people like Margot and her father and her mother that were more forgotten in the context of history for students who maybe have to read Anne Frank's diary in school but don't look into further context of historical documents?
Yeah, but it's interesting, because I feel like the diary is not being read as much as it used to be. And there are many kids and adults who really don't know who Anne Frank is. So that's part of, I think, what's happening. It's becoming thought of as kind of ancient history, but really it was so close to our time. And I felt that especially when I walked her footsteps and went to her apartment and was in the park that she used to go to, and there were all these children in the park, and you could hear children's voices. It's just very close to us. And I think the important thing is for it not to be forgotten, because, when you forget something like that, you tend to repeat it. And a lot of it has to do with being an immigrant in a country that doesn't want you. And so I think it's still very important for kids and adults to be reading the diary.
Yes, and it's easy for people, especially because this current generation growing up is living through unprecedented times and seeing once-in-a-lifetime events happening 4 or 5 times as they come up. So it's easy to forget that these things are more recent than we like to think about. And that you said it perfectly. When you forget about history, you're doomed to repeat it. Yeah. And much like how it's about immigrants in a new space, we're seeing a very similar rise in hostility towards immigrants in the United States today.
Absolutely. I feel like with this story and with the book that I wrote, it's both very specific. It's about, a Jewish girl during World War II, during the rise of the Nazis, but it's also about what it feels like to be other, to be different, to be treated like you're not human, to be an immigrant that nobody wants. I think it's, I think it works both ways. It's kind of two stories in a way.
Yes, the best fiction always manages to capture that sweet spot of, while it is a hyper-specific story of a real person, the experiences they go through are things that people can connect with in meaningful ways. And that's why reading has always been one of the best ways for people to stretch that muscle of empathy.
Yes, 100%. I totally agree with you. And I feel like, for me, as a kid reading, it's really that's how I found out about the world. I mean, through the books that I read, through the novels that I read, that was my education.
Right. And whenever you read a book, you're expanding your worldview, and especially with historical fiction like this, you're learning about places that are very real, and it's almost like a teaching tool and a supplementary material that can be used to help broaden people's scope of the world.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing that I found to be really interesting about Anne is this having this secret life, this idea that you have an imagination, you're creative, you kind of are building your own world, even as the world around you is falling apart, and that's kind of what it means to be a writer or an artist, is that you feel like you want to help recreate the world.
Right, and even if you think about it, Anne Frank's diary, she was writing in a diary thoughts that she probably never said out loud to anybody.
Yeah. One of her dreams was to be a great writer. And, in a very sad way, that dream was realized. She is a great writer. She's read, and she's the reason that we remember that time. She's kind of the voice of a whole generation.
Right, and it's almost sad about how that she is a voice of a generation, that there's a period of world history that has this ink black stain on it of what humans were capable of doing to other members of the same race.
Yeah. Yeah. It is still shocking when you look back on it. And, but, it continues to be shocking what people, what hatred can do. I think we're constantly reminded of it. But this is such a blatant, specific case of, the acts against the Jews in Europe. But I think, this is part of humanity, and it's something that we always have to fight against.
Right, it's part of humanity, and it always comes back to, you can't forget your history, even if it's something that's so tragic.
Right. It's interesting because I think a lot of what my novel is about is the importance of storytelling, and that if you write it down, they can't forget it. And if you write it down, it lasts. So I totally agree with that.
Right, and if it's written down, it can't be ignored, and that's something that even when you're looking at the way that World War II is taught in American schools, sometimes it feels like outside of Anne Frank's diary, we don't have a lot of first-hand sources of what was going on with for people at the time.
Yeah, although when I was doing research in Amsterdam, I met with a professor who was doing a project about how many teenagers there were in hiding during that time, some of them blocks away from where Anne was, and many of them did write diaries. Many of those diaries were lost, so we don't have them, or they just weren't as universal as Anne's. There's something about Anne's voice that made the diary into true literature. And I think that's the difference of it, But I think there were many people tried to tell their stories, but it's just it's very easy to lose these things.
I think that one of the things that makes Anne Frank's diary stand out is how raw and emotional it is, and how the author is a young girl, and it's really hard to ignore the innocence of that perspective.
Yeah, there's that very famous line that's something like, "I still believe that people are good." And, that is a beautiful young thing to say, and, reminds us how it's possible to still have faith in the world, even during terrible times. I think that's one of the reasons I was drawn to Anne Frank and to the diary, was that despite everything, that she continued to feel like, it would be possible to change the world.
And do you think that there's a fine line between believing in the good of humanity and turning your back against some of the darker, more evil aspects?
I think so. I think you really can't turn your back on those evil aspects. I think she, as a kid, wasn't informed, and even her family, they didn't really realize what was happening. They were so lied to by the government. They didn't realize that when they gave their names and address, what the reason was that for that was that they were going to be collected by soldiers and taken away to concentration camps. They thought they were doing it because it was like a census. I mean, it's very hard to believe how deep evil is, and I think that was part of it.
And it also speaks to a simple fact that I always like to bring up is that children are more attentive and aware and more knowledgeable than people often give them credit for.
Yes, I think that's 100% true. And I think, even when they're protected, they can see through it. There's a line that I read somewhere that really has stayed with me in terms of writing this book is that we live our lives going forward, but we don't understand it until we go backward. So while you're living your life, there's so much that you don't understand, not just about yourself, but about the world and politics and what's going on. It's only when you're looking back at what happened that you can really make sense out of it.
Right, and you may not be aware of everything, like Anne Frank. Maybe on the surface, on some level, she knew why, but she couldn't maybe articulate where the hate was coming from. Mm-hmm. But there's also the idea that children are just more honest. They're more emotionally true. There's no incentive for them to conceal their emotions about something.
Yeah, I totally think that's true. And I think, in the research that I did, that she seemed very puzzled by, why are we considered different? It was a very difficult concept for her to get, which makes perfect sense.
Right, and it does come to that idea of seeing the best of humanity, believing that people are, on the whole, believing that folks are basically decent. But there's exceptions. There's dark truths to the world, and I think that Anne Frank, the story of Anne Frank, is probably the most extreme version of that, but the most real. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think, she is the voice for a lot of other people. And I think, one of the reasons I fell in love with the book when I was 12, but one of the reasons so many people relate to the book is that you feel like you know her. It's very personal. And that's because of her voice and how honest and true it feels.
And there are so many different aspects to it. And as you were mentioning, it's also a story of being immigrants in a foreign land. Do you feel that the otherization doesn't just come from religious persecution, but mostly comes from a xenophobic having to target someone like a convenient scapegoat type of thing?
Well, I think it's both. I think this is a very specific story about a specific happening of the persecution of the Jews, but I think it does happen where people are afraid of anything different, where they're afraid that people will take over their jobs, their money, their lives, and I think there is a real fear of others, and I think you see it all the time in terms of immigration. And one thing I really didn't know was that how many Jews tried to escape from Europe to come to this country and were turned away, and the boats were sent back to Europe, and the people on board were killed. I mean, that kind of thing is still happening, and for different reasons. And I think it's just something that we need to be aware of and be reminded of all the time.
Right, and it's just a tale as old as time. It's unfortunate, and it just continues to happen. We hope it doesn't happen to the scale and severity that it did during World War II, but we see it. We still see it happening. Yeah,
definitely.
Alice, as we close out this interview, I do like to ask this question of every author. So you can answer this in any way that you see appropriate, and take as much time if you like. No, don't worry, it's not a hard question.
Okay.
So, Alice, how do you describe yourself and the work that you do as an author?
Well, I don't know if I have one sentence for it, but I always feel like I'm trying to tell the stories of women who were not able to tell their own stories, and that I was very much affected by fairy tales as a kid. And one of the reasons why was because in most fairy tales, girls are the ones who rescue themselves. So I feel like that's kind of a theme that I'm constantly interested in.
Thank you very much, Alice.
Thank you.
That was Alice Hoffman. You can find more about Alice on her website, alicehoffman.com, or on Instagram at @AHoffmanWriter. Her new book, When We Flew Away, a novel of Anne Frank before the diary, is available now wherever books are sold. Resources are available on patreon.com/thebookfair. This concludes another episode of The Book Fair, Children's Literature for Grown-Ups. Thank you so much for listening, and as always, I'll talk at you next time.